Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Read by Michael York. This is complete and unabridged.
Chapter 1. A squat, grey building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance the words, Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, and in a shield, the World State's motto, Community, Identity, Stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north. Cold for all the summer beyond the panes, for all the tropical heat of the room itself. A harsh, thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic gooseflesh, but finding only the glass and nickel and bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Wintriness responded to wintriness. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale, corpse-coloured rubber. The light was frozen, dead. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopes did it borrow a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak, in long recession down the work tables. "And this," said the director, opening the door, "is the fertilizing room." Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged. As the director of hatcheries and conditioning entered the room, in the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded, soliloquizing hum or whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young, pink and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook, in which, whenever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled. Straight from the horse's mouth. It was a rare privilege. The DHC for Central London always made a point of personally conducting his new students round the various departments. "Just to give you a general idea," he would explain to them. For of course some sort of general idea they must have, if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one, if they were to be good and happy members of society, as possible. For particulars, as everyone knows, make for virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers, but fret-sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. "Tomorrow," he would add, smiling at them with a slightly menacing geniality, "you'll be settling down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege. Straight from the horse's mouth into the notebook. The boys scribbled like mad. Tall and rather thin, but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big, rather prominent teeth, just covered, when he was not talking, by his full, floridly curved lips. Old, young, 30, 50, 55, it was hard to say. And anyhow, the question didn't arise. In this year of stability, AF 632, it didn't occur to you to ask it. "I shall begin at the beginning," said the DHC, and the more zealous students recorded his intentions in their notebooks. Begin at the beginning. "These," he waved his hand, "are the incubators." And opening an insulated door, he showed them racks upon racks of numbered test tubes. "The week's supply of ova, kept," he explained, "at blood heat, whereas the male gametes," and here he opened another door, "they have to be kept at 35 instead of 37. Full blood heat sterilizes. Rams wrapped in theramogene beget no lambs." Still leaning against the incubators, he gave them, while the pencils scurried illegibly across the pages, a brief description of the modern fertilizing process, spoke first, of course, of its surgical introduction. The operation undergone voluntarily for the good of society, not to mention the fact that it carries a bonus amounting to 6 months' salary. Continued with some account of the technique for preserving the excised ovary alive and actively developing. Passed on to a consideration of optimum temperature, salinity, viscosity. Referred to the liquor in which the detached and ripened eggs were kept, and, leading his charges to the work tables, actually showed them how this liquor was drawn off from the test tubes, how it was let out drop by drop onto the specially warmed slides of the microscopes, how the eggs which it contained were inspected for abnormalities, counted and transferred to a porous receptacle, how, and he now took them to watch the operation, this receptacle was immersed in a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermatozoa, at a minimum concentration of 100,000 per cubic centimetre, he insisted, and how, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the liquor and its contents re-examined, how, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and, if necessary, yet again, how the fertilized ova went back to the incubators, where the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while the gammas, deltas, and epsilons were brought out again, after only 36 hours, to undergo Bokanovsky's process. Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult. Normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide. From 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only 1 grew before. Progress. Essentially, the DHC concluded, Bokanovskification consists of a series of arrests of development. We check the normal growth, and paradoxically enough, the egg responds by budding. Responds by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed. On a very slowly moving band, a rack full of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rack full was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard X-rays being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into 2. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to the incubators, where the buds began to develop, then, after 2 days, were suddenly chilled and checked. 2, 4, 8, the buds in their turn budded, and having budded were dosed almost to death with alcohol. Consequently burgeoned again, and having budded, bud out of bud out of bud, were thereafter, further arrest being generally fatal, left to develop in peace. By which time the original egg was in a fair way to becoming anything from 8 to 96 embryos. A prodigious improvement, you will agree, on nature. Identical twins, but not in piddling 2s and 3s, as in the old viviparous days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide, actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores, the director repeated, and flung out his arms, as though he were distributing largesse. Scores! But one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. "My good boy," the director wheeled sharply round on him, "can't you see? Can't you see?" He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. "Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability." Major instruments of social stability. Standard men and women, in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. "You really know where you are. For the first time in history," He quoted the planetary motto, "Community, identity, stability." Grand words. If we could Bokanovskify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons. Millions of identical twins. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head, we can't Bokanovskify indefinitely. 96 seemed to be the limit, 72 a good average. From the same ovary, and with gametes of the same male, to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible. That was the best, sadly a second best, that they could do. And even that was difficult. For in nature it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity. But our business is to stabilize the population at this moment, here and now. Dribbling out twins over a quarter of a century, what would be the use of that? Obviously, no use at all. But Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 150 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and Bokanovskify. In other words, multiply by 72, and you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield us over 15,000 adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young man who happened to be passing at the moment, "Mr. Foster," he called. The ruddy young man approached. "Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster?" 16,012 in this centre, Mr. Foster replied without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, had a vivacious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012 in 189 batches of identicals. But of course they've done much better, he rattled on, in some of the tropical centres. Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mombasa has actually touched the 17,000 mark. But then they have unfair advantages. You should see the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary. It's quite astonishing when you are used to working with European material. Still, he added with a laugh, but the light of combat was in his eyes, and the lift of his chin was challenging. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful Delta Minus ovary at this moment, only just 18 months old. Over 12,700 children already, either decanted or in embryo, and still going strong. We'll beat them yet. "That's the spirit I like," cried the director, and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. "Come along with us and give these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge." Mr. Foster smiled modestly. "With pleasure." They went. In the bottling room all was harmonious bustle and ordered activity. Flaps of fresh sow's peritoneum, ready cut to the proper size, came shooting up in little lifts from the organ store in the sub-basement. Whiz, and then click, the lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner had only to reach out a hand, take the flap, insert, smooth down, and before the lined bottle had time to travel out of reach along the endless band, whiz, click, another flap of peritoneum had shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle, the next of that slow, interminable procession on the band. Next to the liners stood the matriculators. The procession advanced. One by one the eggs were transferred from their test tubes to the larger containers. Deftly the peritoneal lining was slit, the morula dropped into place, the saline solution poured in, and already the bottle had passed, and it was the turn of the labellers. Heredity, date of fertilization, membership of Bokanovsky group. Details were transferred from test tube to bottle. No longer anonymous, but named, identified, the procession marched slowly on through an opening in the wall, slowly on, into the social predestination room. 88 cubic meters of card index, said Mr. Foster with relish as they entered. "Containing all the relevant information," added the director. "Brought up to date every morning, and coordinated every afternoon, on the basis of which they make their calculations. So many individuals of such and such quality," said Mr. Foster, "distributed in such and such quantities. The optimum decanting rate at any given moment. Unforeseen wastages promptly made good." "Promptly," repeated Mr. Foster. "If you knew the amount of overtime I had to put in after the last Japanese earthquake." He laughed good-humouredly and shook his head. "The predestinators send in their figures to the fertilizers, who give them the embryos they ask for. And the bottles come in here to be predestinated in detail. After which they are sent down to the embryo store, where we now proceed ourselves." And opening a door, Mr. Foster led the way down a staircase to the basement. The temperature was still tropical. They descended into a thickening twilight. 2 doors and a passage with a double turn ensured the cellar against any possible infiltration of the day. "Embryos are like photographic film," said Mr. Foster waggishly, as he pushed open the second door. "They can only stand red light." And in effect the sultry darkness into which the students now followed him was visible and crimson, like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer's afternoon. The bulging flanks of row on receding row and tier above tier of bottles glinted with innumerable rubies, and among the rubies moved the dim red spectres of men and women with purple eyes, and all the symptoms of lupus. The hum and rattle of machinery faintly stirred the air. "Give them a few figures, Mr. Foster," said the director, who was tired of talking. Mr. Foster was only too happy to give them a few figures. 220 meters long, 200 wide, 10 high. He pointed upwards. Like chickens drinking, the students lifted their eyes towards the distant ceiling. 3 tiers of racks, ground floor level, first gallery, second gallery. The spidery steelwork of gallery above gallery faded away in all directions into the dark. Near them, 3 red ghosts were busily unloading demijohns from a moving staircase. The escalator from the social predestination room. Each bottle could be placed on one of 15 racks. Each rack, though you couldn't see it, was a conveyor travelling at the rate of 33 1/3 centimetres an hour. 267 days at 8 metres a day. 2,136 metres in all. 1 circuit of the cellar at ground level, 1 on the first gallery, half on the second, and on the 267th morning, daylight in the decanting room. Independent existence, so-called. But in the interval, Mr. Foster concluded, we've managed to do a lot to them. Oh, a very great deal. His laugh was knowing and triumphant. "That's the spirit I like," said the director once more. "Let's walk round. You tell them everything, Mr. Foster." Mr. Foster duly told them. Told them of the growing embryo on its bed of peritoneum, made them taste the rich blood surrogate on which it fed, explained why it had to be stimulated with placentin and thyroxin, told them of the corpus luteum extract, showed them the jets through which at every 12th metre from 0 to 2040 it was automatically injected, spoke of those gradually increasing doses of pituitary administered during the final 96 metres of their course, described the artificial maternal circulation installed on every bottle at metre 112, showed them the reservoir of blood surrogate, the centrifugal pump that kept the liquid moving over the placenta and drove it through the synthetic lung and waste product filter, referred to the embryo's troublesome tendency to anemia, to the massive doses of hog stomach extract and fetal foal's liver with which, in consequence, it had to be supplied. Showed them the simple mechanism by means of which, during the last 2 metres out of every 8, all the embryos were simultaneously shaken into familiarity with movement, hinted at the gravity of the so-called trauma of decanting, and enumerated the precautions taken to minimize, by a suitable training of the bottled embryo, that dangerous shock. Told them of the tests for sex carried out in the neighborhood of meter 200. Explained the system of labeling, a T for the males, a circle for the females, and for those who were destined to become free martins, a question mark, black on a white ground. For of course, said Mr. Foster, in the vast majority of cases fertility is merely a nuisance. One fertile ovary in 1200, that would really be quite sufficient for our purposes, but we want to have a good choice. And of course one must always leave an enormous margin of safety, so we allow as many as 30% of the female embryos to develop normally. The others get a dose of male sex hormones every 24 meters for the rest of the course. Result, they're decanted as free martins, structurally quite normal. Except he had to admit that they do have just the slightest tendency to grow beards. But sterile, guaranteed sterile. Which brings us at last, continued Mr. Foster, out of the realm of mere slavish imitation of nature into the much more interesting world of human invention. He rubbed his hands. For of course they didn't content themselves with merely hatching out embryos. Any cow could do that. We also predestine and condition. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons, as future sewage workers or future— he was going to say future world controllers, but correcting himself said future directors of hatcheries instead. The DHC acknowledged the compliment with a smile. They were passing meter 320 on rack 11. A young beta-minus mechanic was busy with screwdriver and spanner on the blood surrogate pump of a passing bottle. The hum of the electric motor deepened by fractions of a tone as he turned the nuts. Down, down. A final twist, a glance at the revolution counter, and he was done. He moved 2 paces down the line and began the same process on the next pump. "Reducing the number of revolutions per minute," Mr. Foster explained. "The surrogate goes round slower, therefore passes through the lung at longer intervals, therefore gives the embryo less oxygen. Nothing like oxygen shortage for keeping an embryo below par." And again he rubbed his hands. "But why do you want to keep the embryo below par?" asked an ingenuous student. "Ass!" said the director, breaking a long silence. "Hasn't it occurred to you that an epsilon embryo must have an epsilon environment, as well as an epsilon heredity?" It evidently hadn't occurred to him. He was covered with confusion. "The lower the caste," said Mr. Foster, "the shorter the oxygen." The first organ affected was the brain. After that, the skeleton. At 70% of normal oxygen, you got dwarfs. At less than 70, eyeless monsters, who are no use at all, concluded Mr. Foster. Whereas, his voice became confidential and eager, if they could discover a technique for shortening the period of maturation, what a triumph, what a benefaction to society! Consider the horse. They considered it. Mature at 6, the elephant at 10. While at 13 a man is not yet sexually mature, and is only full-grown at 20. Hence, of course, that fruit of delayed development, the human intelligence. "But in epsilons," said Mr. Foster very justly, "we don't need human intelligence." Didn't need and didn't get it. But though the epsilon mind was matured at 10, the epsilon body was not fit to work till 18. Long years of superfluous and wasted immaturity. If the physical development could be speeded up till it was as quick, say, as a cow's, what an enormous saving to the community. "Enormous!" murmured the students. Mr. Foster's enthusiasm was infectious. He became rather technical, spoke of the abnormal endocrine coordination which made men grow so slowly. Postulated a germinal mutation to account for it. Could the effects of this germinal mutation be undone? Could the individual epsilon embryo be made to revert, by a suitable technique, to the normality of dogs and cows? That was the problem, and it was all but solved. Pilkington at Mombasa had produced individuals who were sexually mature at 4 and full-grown at 6.5. A scientific triumph, but socially useless. 6-year-old men and women were too stupid to do even epsilon work, and the process was an all-or-nothing one. Either you failed to modify at all, or else you modified the whole way. They were still trying to find the ideal compromise between adults of 20 and adults of 6. So far, without success. Mr. Foster sighed and shook his head. Their wanderings through the crimson twilight had brought them to the neighborhood of meter 170 on Rack 9. From this point onwards, Rack 9 was enclosed, and the bottles performed the remainder of their journey in a kind of tunnel, interrupted here and there by openings 2 or 3 meters wide. "Heat conditioning," said Mr. Foster. Hot tunnels alternated with cool tunnels. Coolness was wedded to discomfort in the form of hard X-rays. By the time they were decanted, the embryos had a horror of cold. They were predestined to emigrate to the tropics, to be miners and acetate silk spinners and steel workers. Later on, their minds would be made to endorse the judgment of their bodies. "We condition them to thrive on heat," concluded Mr. Foster. "Our colleagues upstairs will teach them to love it." "And that," put in the director sententiously, "that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny." In a gap between 2 tunnels, a nurse was delicately probing with a long, fine syringe into the gelatinous contents of a passing bottle. The students and their guide stood watching her for a few moments in silence. "Well, Leonard," said Mr. Foster, when at last she withdrew the syringe and straightened herself up. The girl turned with a start. One could see that for all the lupus and the purple eyes, she was uncommonly pretty. "Henry!" Her smile flashed redly at him, a row of coral teeth. "Charming, charming," murmured the director, and, giving her 2 or 3 little pats, received in exchange a rather deferential smile for himself. "What are you giving them?" asked Mr. Foster, making his tone very professional. "Oh, the usual typhoid and sleeping sickness. Tropical workers start being inoculated at meter 150. Mr. Foster explained to the students. "The embryos still have gills. We immunize the fish against the future man's diseases." Then, turning back to Leonard, 10 to 5 on the roof this afternoon, he said, "as usual." "Charming," said the director once more, and with a final pat moved away after the others. On Rack 10, rows of Next Generation's chemical workers were being trained in the toleration of lead, caustic soda, tar, chlorine. The first of a batch of 250 embryonic rocket-plane engineers was just passing the 1100-meter mark on Rack 3. A special mechanism kept their containers in constant rotation. "To improve their sense of balance," Mr. Foster explained. "Doing repairs on the outside of a rocket in mid-air is a ticklish job. We slacken off the circulation when they're right way up, so that they're half-starved, and double the flow of surrogate when they're upside down. They learn to associate topsy-turvydom with well-being. In fact, they're only truly happy when they're standing on their heads. And now," Mr. Foster went on, "I'd like to show you some very interesting conditioning for Alpha Plus intellectuals. We have a big batch of them on Rack 5. First gallery level," he called to 2 boys who had started to go down to the ground floor. "They're around meter 900, he explained. "You can't really do any useful intellectual conditioning till the fetuses have lost their tails. Follow me." But the director had looked at his watch. 10 to 3, he said. "No time for the intellectual embryos, I'm afraid. We must go up to the nurseries before the children have finished their afternoon sleep." Mr. Foster was disappointed. "At least one glance at the decanting room," he pleaded. "Very well, then." The director smiled indulgently. "Just one glance." Chapter 2. Mr. Foster was left in the decanting room. The DHC and his students stepped into the nearest lift, and were carried up to the 5th floor. Infant nurseries, Neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms, announced the notice board. The director opened a door. They were in a large, bare room, very bright and sunny, for the whole of the southern wall was a single window. Half a dozen nurses, trousered and jacketed in the regulation white viscous linen uniform, their hair aseptically hidden under white caps, were engaged in setting out bowls of roses in a long row across the floor. Big bowls, packed tight with blossom, thousands of petals, ripe blown and silkily smooth like the cheeks of innumerable little cherubs. But of cherubs, in that bright light, not exclusively pink and Aryan, but also luminously Chinese, also Mexican, also apoplectic with too much blowing of celestial trumpets, also pale as death, pale with the posthumous whiteness of marble. The nurses stiffened to attention as the DHC came in. "Set out the books," he said curtly. In silence the nurses obeyed his command. Between the rose bowls the books were duly set out. A row of nursery quartos opened invitingly, each at some gaily coloured image of beast or fish or bird. "Now bring in the children." They hurried out of the room, and returned in a minute or two, each pushing a kind of tall dumb-waiter laden, on all its 4 wire-netted shelves, with 8-month-old babies, all exactly alike. A Bokanovsky group, it was evident, and all, since their caste was Delta, dressed in khaki. "Put them down on the floor." The infants were unloaded. "Now turn them so that they can see the flowers and books." Turned, the babies at once fell silent, then began to crawl towards those clusters of sleek colours, those shapes so gay and brilliant on the white pages. As they approached, the sun came out of a momentary eclipse behind a cloud. The roses flamed up as though with a sudden passion from within. A new and profound significance seemed to suffuse the shining pages of the books. From the ranks of the crawling babies came little squeals of excitement, gurgles, and twitterings of pleasure. The director rubbed his hands. "Excellent," he said. "It might almost have been done on purpose." The swiftest crawlers were already at their goal. Small hands reached out uncertainly, touched, grasped, unpetaling the transfigured roses, crumpling the illuminated pages of the books. The director waited until all were happily busy. Then, "Watch carefully," he said, and lifting his hand, he gave the signal. The head nurse, who was standing by a switchboard at the other end of the room, pressed down a little lever. There was a violent explosion. Shriller and even shriller, a siren shrieked. Alarm bells maddeningly sounded. The children started, screamed. Their faces were distorted with terror. "And now," the director shouted, for the noise was deafening, "now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock." He waved his hand again, and the head nurse pressed a second lever. The screaming of the babies suddenly changed its tone. There was something desperate, almost insane, about the sharp, spasmodic yelps to which they now gave utterance. Their little bodies twitched and stiffened, their limbs moved jerkily, as if to the tug of unseen wires. "We can electrify that whole strip of floor," bawled the director in explanation. "But that's enough," he signalled to the nurse. The explosion ceased. The bells stopped ringing. The shriek of the siren died down from tone to tone into silence. The stiffly twitching bodies relaxed, and what had become the sob and yelp of infant maniacs broadened out once more into a normal howl of ordinary terror. "Offer them the flowers and the books again." The nurses obeyed, but at the approach of the roses, at the mere sight of those gaily coloured images of pussy and cock-a-doodle-doo and bar-bar black sheep, the infants shrank away in horror. The volume of their howling suddenly increased. "Observe!" said the director triumphantly. "Observe!" Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks, Already in the infant mind, these couples were compromisingly linked, and after 200 repetitions of the same or a similar lesson, would be wedded indissolubly. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. They'll grow up with what the psychologists used to call an instinctive hatred of books and flowers. Reflexes unalterably conditioned. They'll be safe from books and botany all their lives. The director turned to his nurses. "Take them away again." Still yelling, the khaki babies were loaded onto their dumb waiters and wheeled out, leaving behind them the smell of sour milk and a most welcome silence. One of the students held up his hand, and though he could see quite well why you couldn't have lower-caste people wasting the community's time over books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something which might undesirably decondition one of their reflexes, yet, well, he couldn't understand about the flowers. Why go to the trouble of making it psychologically impossible for deltas to like flowers? Patiently, the DHC explained. If the children were made to scream at the sight of a rose, that was on grounds of high economic policy. Not so very long ago, a century or thereabouts, gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers in particular, and wild nature in general. The idea was to make them want to be going out into the country at every available opportunity, and so compel them to consume transport. And didn't they consume transport? Asked the student. Quite a lot, the DHC replied, but nothing else. Primroses and landscapes, he pointed out, have one grave defect. They are gratuitous. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes, to abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. For of course it was essential they should keep on going to the country, even though they hated it. The problem was to find an economically sounder reason for consuming transport than a mere affection for primroses and landscapes. It was duly found. "We condition the masses to hate the country," concluded the director. "But simultaneously we condition them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport. Hence those electric shocks." "I see," said the student, and was silent, lost in admiration. There was a silence. Then, clearing his throat, "Once upon a time," the director began, "while our Ford was still on earth, there was a little boy called Rubin Rabinovich. Rubin was the child of Polish-speaking parents." The director interrupted himself. "You know what Polish is, I suppose?" "A dead language. Like French and German," added another student, officiously showing off his learning. "And a parent?" questioned the DHC. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One, at last, had the courage to raise a hand. "Human beings used to be—" He hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. "Well, they used to be viviparous." "Quite right," the director nodded approvingly. "And when the babies were decanted—" "Born," came the correction. "Well, then they were the parents. I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones." The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. "In brief," the director summed up, "the parents were the father and the mother." The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boy's eye-avoiding silence. "Mother!" he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science, and, leaning back in his chair, "These," he said gravely, "are unpleasant facts, I know it. But then most historical facts are unpleasant." He returned to little Reuben, in whose room, one evening, by an oversight, his father and mother, crash, crash, happened to leave the radio turned on. For you must remember that in those days of gross, viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents, and not in state conditioning centres. While the child was asleep, a broadcast program from London suddenly started to come through, and the next morning, to the astonishment of his crash and crash, the more daring of the boys ventured to grin at one another, little Reuben woke up repeating word for word a long lecture by that curious old writer, one of the very few whose works have been permitted to come down to us, George Bernard Shaw, who was speaking, according to a well-authenticated tradition, about his own genius. To little Reuben's wink and snigger, this lecture was, of course, perfectly incomprehensible, and imagining that their child had suddenly gone mad, they sent for a doctor. He fortunately understood English, recognized the discourse as that which Shaw had broadcasted the previous evening, realized the significance of what had happened, and sent a letter to the medical press about it. The principle of sleep teaching, or hypnopedia, had been discovered. The DHC made an impressive pause. The principle had been discovered, but many, many years were to elapse before that principle was usefully applied. The case of little Reuben was only 23 years after our Ford's first T-model was put on the market. Here the director made a sign of the T on his stomach, and all the students reverently followed suit. And yet, furiously the students scribbled, Hypnopedia first used officially in AF 214. Why not before? 2 reasons. A, these early experimenters, the DHC was saying, were on the wrong track. They thought that Hypnopedia could be made an instrument of intellectual education. A small boy asleep on his right side, the right arm stuck out, the right hand hanging limp over the edge of the bed. Through a round grating in the side of a box, a voice speaks softly. The Nile is the longest river in Africa, and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe, although falling short of the length of the Mississippi, Missouri. The Nile is at the head of all rivers, as regards the length of its basin, which extends through 35 degrees of latitude. At breakfast the next morning, "Tommy," someone says, "do you know which is the longest river in Africa?" A shaking of the head. "But don't you remember something that begins, 'The Nile is'?" "The Nile is the longest river in Africa, and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe." The words came rushing out, although falling short of, "Well now, which is the longest river in Africa?" The eyes are blank. "I don't know." "But the Nile, Tommy." "The Nile is the longest river in Africa and second." "Then which river is the longest, Tommy?" Tommy bursts into tears. "I don't know," he howls. That howl, the director made it plain, discouraged the earliest investigators. The experiments were abandoned. No further attempt was made to teach children the length of the Nile in their sleep. Quite rightly. You can't learn a science unless you know what it's all about. "Whereas, if they'd only started on moral education," said the director, leading the way towards the door. The students followed him, desperately scribbling as they walked, and all the way up in the lift. "Moral education which ought never in any circumstances to be rational." "Silence, silence," whispered a loudspeaker as they stepped out at the 14th floor, and "Silence, silence," the trumpet mouths indefatigably repeated at intervals down every corridor. The students, and even the director himself, rose automatically to the tips of their toes. They were alphas, of course, but even alphas have been well conditioned. Silence, silence. All the air of the 14th floor was sibilant with the categorical imperative. 50 yards of tiptoeing brought them to a door, which the director cautiously opened. They stepped over the threshold into the twilight of a shuttered dormitory. 80 cots stood in a row against the wall. There was a sound of light, regular breathing, and a continuous murmur, as of very faint voices, remotely whispering. A nurse rose as they entered, and came to attention before the director. "What's the lesson this afternoon?" he asked. "We had elementary sex for the first 40 minutes, she answered, "but now it's switched over to elementary class consciousness." The director walked slowly down the long line of cots. Rosy and relaxed with sleep, 80 little boys and girls lay softly breathing. There was a whisper under every pillow. The DHC halted, and, bending over one of the little beds, listened attentively. "Elementary class consciousness, did you say? Let's have it repeated a little louder by the trumpet." At the end of the room, a loudspeaker projected from the wall. The director walked up to it and pressed a switch. "All wear green," said a soft but very distinct voice, beginning in the middle of a sentence, "and Delta children wear khaki. Oh, no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta." There was a pause. Then the voice began again. "Alpha children wear gray. They work much harder than we do, because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and Delta children wear khaki. Oh, no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able—" The director pushed back the switch. The voice was silent. Only its thin ghost continued to mutter from beneath the 80 pillows. "They'll have that repeated 40 or 50 times more before they wake, then again on Thursday, and again on Saturday. 120 times 3 times a week for 30 months, after which they go on to a more advanced lesson." Roses and electric shocks, the khaki of deltas, and a whiff of asafoetida wedded indissolubly before the child can speak. But wordless conditioning is crude and wholesale, cannot bring home the finer distinctions, cannot inculcate the more complex courses of behavior. For that there must be words, but words without reason. In brief, hypnopedia. "The greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time." The students took it down in their little books, straight from the horse's mouth. Once more the director touched the switch. "So frightfully clever," the soft, insinuating, indefatigable voice was saying, I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because—" Not so much like drops of water, though water, it is true, can wear holes in the hardest granite. Rather, drops of liquid sealing-wax, drops that adhere, encrust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all one scarlet blob. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind. And not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But all these suggestions are our suggestions. The director almost shouted in triumph. Suggestions from the state! He banged the nearest table. It therefore follows— A noise made him turn round. "Oh, Ford," he said in another tone, "I've gone and woken the children." Chapter 3. Outside in the garden it was playtime. Naked in the warm June sunshine, 600 or 700 little boys and girls were running with shrill yells over the lawns, or playing ball games, or squatting silently in twos and threes among the flowering shrubs. The roses were in bloom. 2 nightingales soliloquized in the buskage. A cuckoo was just going out of tune among the lime trees. The air was drowsy with the murmur of bees and helicopters. The director and his students stood for a short time watching a game of centrifugal bumble-puppy. 20 children were grouped in a circle round a chrome steel tower. A ball, thrown up so as to land on the platform at the top of the tower, rolled down into the interior, fell on a rapidly revolving disc, was hurled through one or other of the numerous apertures pierced in the cylindrical casing, and had to be caught. "Strange," mused the director as they turned away. "Strange to think that even in our Ford's day most games were played without more apparatus than a ball or two and a few sticks, and perhaps a bit of netting. Imagine the folly of allowing people to play elaborate games which do nothing whatever to increase consumption. It's madness. Nowadays the controllers won't approve of any new game unless it can be shown that it requires at least as much apparatus as the most complicated of existing games." He interrupted himself. "That's a charming little group," he said, pointing. In a little grassy bay, between tall clumps of Mediterranean heather, 2 children, a little boy of about 7, and a little girl who might have been a year older, were playing very gravely, and with all the focused attention of scientists intent on a labor of discovery, a rudimentary sexual game. "Charming, charming," the DHC repeated sentimentally. "Charming," the boys politely agreed, but their smile was rather patronizing. They had put aside similar childish amusements too recently to be able to watch them now without a touch of contempt. Charming? But it was just a pair of kids fooling about, that was all. Just kids. "I always think," the director was continuing in the same rather maudlin tone, when he was interrupted by a loud boo-hooing. From a neighbouring shrubbery emerged a nurse, leading by the hand a small boy, who howled as he went. An anxious-looking little girl trotted at her heels. "What's the matter?" asked the director. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing much," she answered. "It's just that this little boy seems rather reluctant to join in the ordinary erotic play. I'd noticed it once or twice before, and now again today. He started yelling just now." "Honestly," put in the anxious-looking little girl, "I didn't mean to hurt him or anything, honestly." "Of course you didn't, dear," said the nurse reassuringly. "And so," she went on, turning back to the director, "I'm taking him to see the assistant superintendent of psychology, just to see if anything's at all abnormal." "Quite right," said the director. "Take him in. You stay here, little girl," he added, as the nurse moved away with her still howling charge. "What's your name?" "Polly Trotsky," "And a very good name, too," said the director. "Run away now and see if you can find some other little boy to play with." The child scampered off into the bushes and was lost to sight. "Exquisite little creature," said the director, looking after her. Then, turning to his students, "What I'm going to tell you now," he said, "may sound incredible. But then, when you are not accustomed to history, most facts about the past do sound incredible." He let out the amazing truth. For a very long period before the time of our Ford, and even for some generations afterwards, erotic play among children had been regarded as abnormal. There was a roar of laughter, and not only abnormal, actually immoral. No, and had therefore been rigorously suppressed. A look of astonished incredulity appeared on the faces of his listeners. Poor little kids not allowed to amuse themselves? They could not believe it. "Even adolescents," the DHC was saying, "even adolescents like yourselves. Not possible. Barring a little surreptitious autoerotism and homosexuality, absolutely nothing." Nothing? In most cases till they were over 20 years old. 20 years old? Echoed the students in a chorus of loud disbelief. 20, the director repeated. "I told you that you'd find it incredible." "But what happened?" they asked. "What were the results?" "The results were terrible." A deep, resonant voice broke startlingly into the dialogue. They looked round. On the fringe of the little group stood a stranger, a man of middle height, black-haired, with a hooked nose, full red lips, eyes very piercing and dark. "Terrible," he repeated. The DHC had at that moment sat down on one of the steel and rubber benches conveniently scattered through the gardens. But at the sight of the stranger, he sprang to his feet and darted forward, his hand outstretched, smiling with all his teeth, effusive. "Controller! What an unexpected pleasure! Boys, what are you thinking of? This is the controller. This is his Fordship, Mustafa Mond." In the 4,000 rooms of the centre, the 4,000 electric clocks simultaneously struck 4. Discarnate voices called from the trumpet mouths. "Main day shift off duty. Second day shift take over. Main day shift off." In the lift, on their way up to the changing rooms, Henry Foster and the assistant director of predestination rather pointedly turned their backs on Bernard Marx from the Psychology Bureau, averted themselves from that unsavory reputation. The faint hum and rattle of machinery still stirred the crimson air in the embryo store. Shifts might come and go, one lupus-coloured face give place to another. Majestically and forever the conveyors crept forward with their load of future men and women. Leonard in a crown walked briskly towards the door. His Fordship Mustafa Mond. The eyes of the saluting students almost popped out of their heads. Mustafa Mond, the resident controller for Western Europe, one of the 10 world controllers, one of the 10. And he sat down on the bench with the DHC. He was going to stay, yes, and actually talk to them, straight from the horse's mouth. Straight from the mouth of Ford himself. 2 shrimp-brown children emerged from a neighbouring shrubbery, stared at them for a moment with large, astonished eyes, then returned to their amusements among the leaves. "You all remember," said the controller in his strong, deep voice, "you all remember, I suppose, that beautiful and inspired saying of our Ford's, 'History is bunk.' History," he repeated slowly, "is Bunk! He waved his hand, and it was as though with an invisible feather whisk he had brushed away a little dust. And the dust was Harappa, was Ur of the Chaldees, some spider-webs, and they were Thebes and Babylon and Knossos and Mycenae. Whisk, whisk, and where was Odysseus? Where was Job? Where was Jupiter and Gautama and Jesus? Whisk, and those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem and the Middle Kingdom, all were gone. Whisk, the place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk, the cathedrals. Whisk, whisk, King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal. Whisk, passion. Whisk, requiem. Whisk, symphony. Whisk.
"Going to the Feelies this evening, Henry?" inquired the assistant predestinator. "I hear the new one of the Alhambra is first-rate. There's a love scene on a bearskin rug. They say it's marvellous. Every hair of the bear reproduced. The most amazing tactual effects."
"That's why you're taught no history," the controller was saying. "But now the time has come." The DHC looked at him nervously. There were those strange rumours of old forbidden books hidden in a safe in the controller's study. Bibles, poetry, Ford knew what. Mustafa Mond intercepted his anxious glance, and the corners of his red lips twitched ironically. "It's all right, Director," he said in a tone of faint derision. "I won't corrupt them." The DHC was overwhelmed with confusion. Those who feel themselves despised do well to look despising. The smile on Bernard Marks's face was contemptuous. Every hair on the bear indeed. "I shall make a point of going," said Henry Foster. Mustafa Mond leaned forward, shook a finger at them. "Just try to realize it," he said, and his voice sent a strange thrill quivering along their diaphragms. "Try to realize what it was like to have a viviparous mother." That smutty word again, but none of them dreamed this time of smiling. "Try to imagine what living with one's family meant." They tried, but obviously without the smallest success. "And do you know what a home was?" They shook their heads. From her dim crimson cellar, Leonard Crown shot up 17 stories, turned to the right as she stepped out of the lift, walked down a long corridor, and, opening the door marked Girls' Dressing Room, plunged into a deafening chaos of arms and bosoms and underclothing. Torrents of hot water were splashing into or gurgling out of 100 baths. Rumbling and hissing, 80 vibro-vacuum massage machines were simultaneously kneading and sucking the firm and sunburnt flesh of 80 superb female specimens. Every one was talking at the top of her voice. A synthetic music machine was warbling out a super cornet solo. "Hello, Fanny," said Lenina to the young woman who had the pegs and locker next to hers. Fanny worked in the bottling room, and her surname was also Crown. But as the 2,000 million inhabitants of the planet had only 10,000 names between them, the coincidence was not particularly surprising. Lenina pulled at her zippers, downward on the jacket, downwards with a double-handed gesture at the two that held trousers, downwards again to loosen her undergarment. Still wearing her shoes and stockings, she walked off towards the bathrooms. Home, home. A few small rooms, stiflingly over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. The controller's evocation was so vivid that one of the boys, more sensitive than the rest, turned pale at the mere description, and was on the point of being sick. Lenina got out of the bath, towelled herself dry, took hold of a long, flexible tube plugged into the wall, presented the nozzle to her breast as though she meant to commit suicide, pressed down the trigger. A blast of warmed air dusted her with the finest talcum powder. 8 different scents and eau de cologne were laid on in little taps over the wash-basin. She turned on the third from the left, dabbed herself with chypre, and, carrying her shoes and stockings in her hand, went out to see if one of the vibro-vacuum machines were free. And home was as squalid psychically as physically. Psychically, it was a rabbit hole, a midden, hot with the frictions of tightly packed life, reeking with emotion. What suffocating intimacies, what dangerous, insane, obscene relationships between the members of the family group. Maniacally, the mother brooded over her children, brooded over them like a cat over its kittens, but a cat that could talk, a cat that could say, my baby, over and over again, my baby, and oh, at my breast, the little hands, the hunger, and that unspeakable agonizing pleasure, till at last my baby sleeps with a bubble of white milk at the corner of his mouth. My little baby sleeps. Yes, said Mustapha Mond, nodding his head, you may well shudder.
Who are you going out with tonight? Leonard asked, returning from the vibrovac like a pearl illuminated from within, pinkly glowing. Nobody. Leonard raised her eyebrows in astonishment. I've been feeling rather out of sorts lately, Fanny explained. Dr. Wells advised me to have a pregnancy substitute. But, my dear, you're only 19. The first pregnancy substitute isn't compulsory till 21. I know, dear, but some people are better if they begin earlier. Dr. Wells told me that brunettes with wide pelvises, like me, ought to have their first pregnancy substitute at 17. So I'm really 2 years late, not 2 years early. She opened the door of her locker and pointed to the row of boxes and labelled files on the upper shelf. Syrup of Corpus luteum. Leonard read the names aloud. Overin guaranteed fresh. Not to be used after August the 1st, AF 632. Mammary gland extract, to be taken 3 times daily before meals with a little water. Placentin, 5 cc to be injected intravenously every 3rd day. Ugh! Leonard shuddered. How I loathe intravenals, don't you? Yes, but when they do one good. Fanny was a particularly sensible girl.
End of Disc 1. Disc 2.
Our Ford, or our Freud, as for some inscrutable reason he chose to call himself whenever he spoke of psychological matters, our Freud had been the first to reveal the appalling dangers of family life. The world was full of fathers, was therefore full of misery, full of mothers, therefore of every kind of perversion from sadism to chastity, full of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, full of madness and suicide. And yet, among the savages of Samoa, in certain islands off the coast of New Guinea, the tropical sunshine lay like warm honey on the naked bodies of children tumbling promiscuously among the hibiscus blossoms. Home was in any one of 20 palm-thatched houses. In the Trobriands, conception was the work of ancestral ghosts. Nobody had ever heard of a father. Extremes, said the controller, meet. for the good reason that they were made to meet.
Dr. Wells said that a 3 months pregnancy substitute now will make all the difference to my health for the next 3 or 4 years. Well, I hope he's right, said Leonard. But, Fanny, do you really mean to say that for the next 3 months you're not supposed to— Oh, no, dear. Only for a week or 2, that's all. I shall spend the evening at the club playing musical bridge. I suppose you're going out. Leonard nodded. Who with? Henry Foster. Again?
Fanny's kind, rather moon-like face took on an incongruous expression of pained and disapproving astonishment.
Do you mean to tell me you're still going out with Henry Foster?
Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. But there were also husbands, wives, lovers. There were also monogamy and romance. Though you probably don't know what those are, said Mustapha Mond. They shook their heads. Family, monogamy, romance. Everywhere exclusiveness, everywhere a focusing of interest, a narrow channeling of impulse and energy. But everyone belongs to everyone else, he concluded, citing the hypnopedic proverb. The students nodded, emphatically agreeing with a statement which, upwards of 62,000 repetitions in the dark, had made them accept not merely as true, but as axiomatic, self-evident, utterly indisputable.
But after all, Leonard was protesting, it's only about 4 months now since I've been having Henry. Only 4 months? I like that. And what's more, Fanny went on, pointing an accusing finger, there's been nobody else except Henry all that time, has there?
Leonard blushed scarlet, but her eyes, the tone of her voice, remained defiant.
No, there hasn't been anyone else, she answered almost truculently, and I jolly well don't see why there should have been. Oh, she jolly well doesn't see why there should have been, Fanny repeated, as though to an invisible listener behind Leonard's left shoulder. Then, with a sudden change of tone, "But seriously," she said, "I really do think you ought to be careful. It's such horribly bad form to go on and on like this with one man. At 40 or 35 it wouldn't be so bad. But at your age, Leonard, no, it really won't do. And you know how strongly the DHC objects to anything intense or long-drawn. 4 months of Henry Foster without having another man? Why, he'd be furious if he knew."
Think of water under pressure in a pipe. They thought of it. "I pierce it once," said the controller. "What a jet!" He pierced it 20 times. There were 20 piddling little fountains. "My baby, my baby. Mother!" The madness is infectious. "My love, my one and only, precious, precious!" Mother, monogamy, romance. High spurts the fountain. Fierce and foamy the wild jet. The urge has but a single outlet. My love, my baby. No wonder these poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What with mothers and lovers, what with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey, what with the temptations and the lonely remorses, what with all the diseases and the endless isolating pain, what with the uncertainties and the poverty, they were forced to feel strongly.
Of course, there's no need to give him up. Have somebody else from time to time, that's all. He has other girls, doesn't he?
Leonard admitted it.
Of course he does. Trust Henry Foster to be the perfect gentleman, always correct. And then there's the director to think of. You know what a stickler.
Nodding.
He patted me on the behind this afternoon, said Leonard.
There, you see,
Fanny was triumphant. That shows what he stands for. The strictest conventionality.
"Stability," said the controller. "Stability. No civilization without social stability. No social stability without individual stability." His voice was a trumpet. Listening, they felt larger, warmer. The machine turns, turns, and must keep on turning forever. It is death if it stands still. 1,000 millions scrabbled the crust of the earth. The wheels began to turn. In 150 years there were 2,000 million. Stop all the wheels. In 150 weeks there are once more only 1,000 millions. 1,000 men and women have starved to death. Wheels must turn steadily, but cannot turn untended. There must be men to tend them, men as steady as the wheels upon their axles, sane men, obedient men, stable in contentment. Crying, "My baby, my mother, my only love!" Groaning, "My sin, my terrible God!" Screaming with pain, muttering with fever, bemoaning old age and poverty. How can they tend the wheels? And if they cannot tend the wheels, the corpses of 1,000 men and women would be hard to bury or burn.
And after all, Fanny's tone was coaxing, it's not as though there were anything painful or disagreeable about having 1 or 2 men besides Henry, and seeing that you ought to be a little more promiscuous—
"Stability," insisted the controller, "stability. The primal and the ultimate need. Stability. Hence all this." With a wave of his hand he indicated the gardens, the huge building of the conditioning centre, the naked children furtive in the undergrowth, or running across the lawns.
Leonard shook her head. "Somehow," she mused, "I hadn't been feeling very keen on promiscuity lately. There are times when one doesn't. Haven't you found that too, Fanny?"
Fanny nodded her sympathy and understanding.
"But one's got to make the effort," she said sententiously. "One's got to play the game. After all, everyone belongs to everyone else."
"Yes, everyone belongs to everyone else," Leonard repeated slowly, and, sighing, was silent for a moment. Then, taking Fanny's hand, gave it a little squeeze. "You're quite right, Fanny, as usual. I'll make the effort." Impulse arrested spills over, and the flood is feeling, the flood is passion, the flood is even madness. It depends on the force of the current, the height and strength of the barrier. The unchecked stream flows smoothly down its appointed channels into a calm well-being. The embryo is hungry, day in, day out. The blood surrogate pump unceasingly turns its 800 revolutions a minute. The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Shorten that interval. Break down all those old unnecessary barriers. "Fortunate boys," said the controller. "No pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you, so far as that is possible, from having emotions at all." "Ford's in his flivver," murmured the DHC. "All's well with the world."
"Lenin a crown?" said Henry Foster, echoing the assistant predestinator's question as he zipped up his trousers. "Oh, she's a splendid girl, wonderfully pneumatic. I'm surprised you haven't had her."
"I can't think how it is I haven't," said the assistant predestinator. "I certainly will at the first opportunity." From his place on the opposite side of the changing-room aisle, Bernard Marks overheard what they were saying, and turned pale.
"And to tell the truth," said Leonard, I'm beginning to get just a tiny bit bored with nothing but Henry every day." She pulled on her left stocking. "Do you know Bernard Marx?" she asked in a tone whose excessive casualness was evidently forced. Fanny looked startled. "You don't mean to say—" "Why not? Bernard's an Alpha Plus. Besides, he asked me to go to one of the savage reservations with him. I've always wanted to see a savage reservation." "But his reputation! What do I care about his reputation? They say he doesn't like obstacle golf." They say, mocked Leonard. "And then he spends most of his time by himself, alone." There was horror in Fanny's voice. "Well, he won't be alone when he's with me. And anyhow, why are people so beastly to him? I think he's rather sweet." She smiled to herself. How absurdly shy he had been, frightened almost, as though she were a world controller and he a gamma-minus machine-minder.
"Consider your own lives," said Mustapha Mond. "Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle?" The question was answered by a negative silence. "Has any of you been compelled to live through a long time interval between consciousness of a desire and its fulfillment?"
"Well—"
began one of the boys, and hesitated.
"Speak up," said the DHC. "Don't keep his Fordship waiting." "I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her."
"And you felt a strong emotion in consequence?"
"Horrible."
"Horrible, precisely," said the controller. "Our ancestors were so stupid and short-sighted that when the first reformers came along and offered to deliver them from those horrible emotions, they wouldn't have anything to do with them."
Talking about her as though she were a bit of meat. Bernard ground his teeth. Have her here, have her there, like mutton, degrading her to so much mutton. She said she'd think it over. She said she'd give me an answer this week. Oh, Ford, Ford, Ford! He would have liked to go up to them and hit them in the face, hard, again and again. "Yes, I really do advise you to try her," Henry Foster was saying.
Take ectogenesis. Pfitzner and Kawaguchi had got the whole technique worked out. But would the government look at it? No. There was something called Christianity. Women were forced to go on being viviparous.
"He's so ugly," said Fanny. "But I rather like his looks. And then so small." Fanny made a grimace. Smallness was so horribly and typically low caste. "I think that's rather sweet," said Leonard. "One feels one would like to pet him, like a cat." Fanny was shocked. "They say somebody made a mistake when he was still in the bottle. Thought he was a gammer and put alcohol into his blood surrogate. That's why he's so stunted." "What nonsense!" Leonard was indignant.
Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about the liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom to be a round peg in a square hole.
"But, my dear chap, you're welcome, I assure you. You're welcome." Henry Foster patted the assistant predestinator on the shoulder. "Everyone belongs to everyone else, after all." 100 repetitions 3 nights a week for 4 years, thought Bernard Marx, who was a specialist on Hypnopedia. 62,400 repetitions makes one truth. Idiots.
Or the caste system. Constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy. as though men were more than physico-chemically equal.
Well, all I can say is that I'm going to accept his invitation.
Bernard hated them, but they were two, they were large, they were strong. The 9 Years' War began in AF 141.
Not even if it were true about the alcohol in his blood surrogate.
Phosgene, chloropicrin, ethyl iodoacetate, diphenylcyanacine, trichlormethyl, chloroformate, dichlorethyl sulfide, not to mention hydrocyanic acid.
Which I simply don't believe, Leonard concluded.
The noise of 14,000 aeroplanes advancing in open order. But in the Kurfürstendamm and the 8th arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bombs is hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag.
Because I do want to see a savage reservation.
CH3 sub 3, C sub 6, H sub 2, left parenthesis, NO sub 2, right parenthesis, sub 3, plus HG left parenthesis, C, NO right parenthesis, sub 2, equals, well, what? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh and mucus, a foot with the boots still on it, flying through the air and landing flop in the middle of the geraniums, the scarlet ones. Such a splendid show that summer.
You're hopeless, Leonard. I give you up.
The Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious.
Back turned to back, Fanny and Leonard continued their changing in silence.
The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse. There was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and—
"Fanny Crown's a nice girl, too," said the assistant predestinator. In the nurseries, the elementary class consciousness lesson was over. The voices were adapting future demand to future industrial supply. "I do love flying," they whispered. "I do love flying. I do love having new clothes. I do love—"
Liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax, but all the same you couldn't do things by force.
Not nearly so pneumatic as Leonard. Oh, not nearly. "But old clothes are beastly," continued the untiring whisper. "We always throw away old clothes. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better—"
Government's an affair of sitting, not hitting. You rule with the brains and the buttocks, never with the fists. For example, there was the conscription of consumption.
"There, I'm ready," said Leonard, but Fanny remained speechless and averted. "Let's make peace, Fanny, darling."
Every man, woman, and child compelled to consume so much a year in the interests of industry. The sole result—
Ending is better than mending. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches. "One of these days," said Fanny with dismal emphasis, "you'll get into trouble."
Conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume. Back to nature.
"I do love flying.
I do love flying. Back to culture. Yes, actually to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. "Do I look all right?" Leonard asked. Her jacket was made of bottle-green acetate cloth with green viscous fur at the cuffs and collar. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns at Golders Green. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Green corduroy shorts and white viscous woolen stockings turned below the knee. Then came the famous British Museum massacre. 2,000 culture fans gassed with dichloroethyl sulfide. A green and white jockey cap shaded Leonard's eyes. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. "In the end," said Mustapha Mond, "the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but infinitely surer methods of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopedia—" And round her waist she wore a silver-mounted green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt, bulging, for Leonard was not a free martin, with the regulation supply of contraceptives. The discoveries of Pfitzner and Kawaguchi were at last made use of, and intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction— "Perfect!" cried Fanny enthusiastically. She could never resist Leonard's charm for long. "And what a perfectly sweet Malthusian belt!" Accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, the blowing up of historical monuments— luckily most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' War— by the suppression of all books published before AF 150. "I simply must get one like it," said Fanny. There were some things called the pyramids, for example. My old black pattern bandolier. And a man called Shakespeare. You've never heard of them, of course. It's an absolute disgrace, that bandolier of mine. Such are the advantages of a really scientific education. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches, the less. The introduction of our Ford's first T-model. I've had it nearly 3 months. Chosen as the opening date of the new era. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better. There was a thing, as I've said before, called Christianity. Ending is better than mending. The ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. I love new clothes. I love new clothes. I love. So essential when there was underproduction, but in an age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen, positively a crime against society. Henry Foster gave it me. All crosses had their tops cut and became T's. There was also a thing called God. It's real Morocco surrogate. We have the World State now, and Ford's Day celebrations, and community sings, and solidarity services. Ford, how I hate them, Bernard Marx was thinking. There was a thing called heaven. But all the same, they used to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. Like meat, like so much meat. There was a thing called the soul, and a thing called immortality. Do ask Henry where he got it. But they used to take morphia and cocaine.
And what makes it worse, she thinks of herself as meat.
2,000 pharmacologists and biochemists were subsidized in AF 178.
He does look glum, said the assistant predestinator, pointing at Bernard Marx.
6 years later, it was being produced commercially, the perfect drug.
Let's bait him.
Euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant.
Glum, Marx? Glum?
The clap on the shoulder made him start, look up. It was that brute, Henry Foster.
What you need is a gram of soma.
All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects.
Ford, I should like to kill him.
But all he did say was, "No, thank you," and fend off the proffered tube of tablets. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like, and come back without so much as a headache or a mythology.
Take it, insisted Henry Foster. Take it.
Stability was practically assured. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments, said the assistant predestinator, citing a piece of homely hypnopedic wisdom. It only remained to conquer old age. "Damn you! Damn you!" shouted Bernard Marx.
Hoity-toity!
Gonadal hormones, transfusion of young blood, magnesium salts. And do remember that a gram is better than a dam! They went out laughing. All the physiological stigmata of old age have been abolished, and along with them, of course—
"Don't forget to ask him about that Malthusian belt," said Fanny.
Along with them, all the old man's mental peculiarities. Characters remain constant throughout a whole lifetime. 2 rounds of obstacle golf to get through before dark. I must fly. Work, play. At 60 our powers and tastes are what they were at 17. Old men in the bad old days used to renounce, retire, take to religion, spend their time reading, thinking. Thinking. Idiots, swine, Bernard Marx was saying to himself as he walked down the corridor to the lift. Now, such is progress, the old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think. Or if ever by some unlucky chance such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there is always soma, delicious soma. 1/2 gram for a half-holiday, 1 gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous East, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning whence they find themselves on the other side of the crevice, safe on the solid ground of daily labour and distraction, scampering from feely to feely, from girl to pneumatic girl, from electromagnetic golf course to— "Go away, little girl!" shouted the DHC angrily. "Go away, little boy! Can't you see that his fortship's busy? Go and do your erotic play somewhere else." "Suffer, little children," said the controller. Slowly, majestically, with a faint humming of machinery, the conveyors moved forward 33 centimeters an hour. In the red darkness glinted innumerable rubies. Chapter 4. The lift was crowded with men from the Alpha changing rooms, and Leonard's entry was greeted by many friendly nods and smiles. She was a popular girl, and at one time or another had spent a night with almost all of them. They were dear boys, she thought, as she returned their salutations. Charming boys. Still, She did wish that George Edsall's ears weren't quite so big. Perhaps he'd been given just a spot too much parathyroid at Mito 328. And looking at Benito Hoover, she couldn't help remembering that he was really too hairy when he took his clothes off. Turning with eyes a little saddened by the recollection of Benito's curly blackness, she saw in a corner the small, thin body, the melancholy face of Bernard Marks. "Bernard!" She stepped up to him. "I was looking for you." Her voice rang clear above the hum of the mounting lift. The others looked round curiously. "I wanted to talk to you about our New Mexico plan." Out of the tail of her eye, she could see Benito Hoover gaping with astonishment. The gape annoyed her. "Surprised I shouldn't be begging to go with him again," she said to herself. Then aloud, and more warmly than ever, "I'd simply love to come with you for a week in July," she went on. Anyhow, she was publicly proving her unfaithfulness to Henry. Fanny ought to be pleased, even though it was Bernard. "That is," Leonard gave him her most deliciously significant smile, "if you still want to have me." Bernard's pale face flushed. What on earth for? She wondered, astonished, but at the same time touched by this strange tribute to her power. "Hadn't we better talk about it somewhere else?" he stammered, looking horribly uncomfortable. "As though I'd been saying something shocking," thought Leonard. "He couldn't look more upset if I made a dirty joke, asked him who his mother was, or something like that." "I mean, with all these people about—" He was choked with confusion. Leonard's laugh was frank and wholly unmalicious. "How funny you are," she said, and she quite genuinely did think him funny. "You'll give me at least a week's warning, won't you?" she went on in another tone. "I suppose we take the Blue Pacific rocket. Does it start from Charing Tea Tower, or is it from Hampstead?" Before Bernard could answer, the lift came to a standstill. "Roof!" called a creaking voice. The liftman was a small, simian creature dressed in the black tunic of an Epsilon Minus semi-moron. "Roof!" He flung open the gates. The warm glory of afternoon sunlight made him start and blink his eyes. "Oh, roof!" he repeated in a voice of rapture. He was as though suddenly and joyfully awakened from a dark, annihilating stupor. "Roof!" He smiled up with a kind of doggedly expectant adoration into the faces of his passengers. Talking and laughing together, they stepped out into the light. The liftman looked after them. "Roof?" he said once more, questioningly. Then a bell rang, and from the ceiling of the lift a loudspeaker began very softly and yet very imperiously to issue its commands. "Go down," it said. "Go down. Floor 18. Go down. Go down. Floor 18. Go down. Go." The liftman slammed the gates, touched a button, and instantly dropped back into the droning twilight of the well, the twilight of his own habitual stupor. It was warm and bright on the roof. The summer afternoon was drowsy with the hum of passing helicopters, and the deeper drone of the rocket planes hastening invisible through the bright sky 5 or 6 miles overhead was like a caress on the soft air. Bernard Marks drew a deep breath. He looked up into the sky and round the blue horizon, and finally down into Leonard's face. "Isn't it beautiful?" His voice trembled a little. She smiled at him with an expression of the most sympathetic understanding. "Simply perfect for Obstacle Gulf," she answered rapturously. "And now I must fly, Bernard. Henry gets cross if I keep him waiting. Let me know in good time about the date." And waving her hand, she ran away across the wide flat roof towards the hangars. Bernard stood watching the retreating twinkle of the white stockings, the sunburnt knees vivaciously bending and unbending, again, and the softer rolling of those well-fitted corduroy shorts beneath the bottle-green jacket. His face wore an expression of pain. "I should say she was pretty," said a loud and cheery voice just behind him. Bernard started and looked round. The chubby red face of Benito Hoover was beaming down at him, beaming with manifest cordiality. Benito was notoriously good-natured. People said of him that he could have got through life without ever touching Soma. The malice and bad tempers from which other people had to take holidays never afflicted him. Reality for Benito was always sunny. "Pneumatic, too, and how!" Then, in another tone, "But I say," he went on, "you do look glum. What you need is a gram of Soma." Diving into his right-hand trouser pocket, Benito produced a file. 1 cubic centimetre cures 10 gloomy... But I say... Bernard had suddenly turned and rushed away. Benito stared after him. What can be the matter with the fellow, he wondered, and, shaking his head, decided that the story about the alcohol having been put into the poor chap's blood surrogate must be true. Touched his brain, I suppose. He put away the Soma bottle, and taking out a packet of sex-hormone chewing gum, stuffed a plug into his cheek, and walked slowly away towards the hangars, ruminating. Henry Foster had had his machine wheeled out of its lock-up, and, when Leonard arrived, was already seated in the cockpit, waiting. 4 minutes late, was all his comment, as she climbed in beside him. He started the engines and threw the helicopter screws into gear. The machine shot vertically into the air. Henry accelerated. The humming of the propeller shrilled from hornet to wasp, from wasp to mosquito. The speedometer showed that they were rising at the best part of 2 kilometers a minute. London diminished beneath them. The huge tabletop buildings were no more in a few seconds than a bed of geometrical mushrooms sprouting from the green of a park and garden. In the midst of them, thin-stalked, a taller, slenderer fungus, the Charing T Tower lifted towards the sky a disk of shining concrete. Like the vague torsos of fabulous athletes, huge fleshy clouds lolled on the blue air above their heads. Out of one of them suddenly dropped a small scarlet insect, buzzing as it fell. "There's the red rocket," said Henry, "just come in from New York." Looking at his watch, 7 minutes behind time, he added, and shook his head. "These Atlantic services, they're really scandalously unpunctual." He took his foot off the accelerator. The humming of the screws overhead dropped an octave and a half, back through wasp and hornet to bumblebee, to cockchafer, to stag-beetle. The upward rush of the machine slackened off. A moment later they were hanging motionless in the air. Henry pushed at a lever. There was a click. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, till it was a circular mist before their eyes, the propeller in front of them began to revolve. The wind of a horizontal speed whistled ever more shrilly in the stays. Henry kept his eye on the revolution counter. When the needle touched the 1200 mark, he threw the helicopter screws out of gear. The machine had enough forward momentum to be able to fly on its planes. Leonard looked down through the window in the floor between her feet. They were flying over the 6-kilometre zone of parkland that separated central London from its first ring of satellite suburbs. The green was maggoty with foreshortened life. Forests of centrifugal bumble-puppy towers gleamed between the trees. Near Shepherd's Bush, 2,000 beta-minus mixed doubles were playing Riemann surface tennis. A double row of escalator fives courts lined the main road from Notting Hill to Willesden. In the Ealing Stadium, a Delta gymnastic display and community sing was in progress. "What a hideous colour khaki is," remarked Leonard, voicing the hypnopedic prejudices of her caste. The buildings of the Hounslow Feely studio covered 7.5 hectares. Near them, a blackened khaki army of labourers was busy revitrifying the surface of the Great West Road. One of the huge travelling crucibles was being tapped as they flew over. The molten stone poured out in a stream of dazzling incandescence across the road. The asbestos rollers came and went. At the tail of an insulated watering cart, the steam rose in white clouds. At Brentford, the Television Corporation's factory was like a small town. "They must be changing the shift," said Leonard. Like aphids and ants, the leaf-green gamma girls, the black semi-morons, swarmed round the entrances, or stood in queues to take their places in the monorail tramcars. Mulberry-coloured beta-minuses came and went among the crowd. The roof of the main building was alive with the alighting and departures of helicopters. "My word," said Leonard, "I'm glad I'm not a gamma." 10 minutes later they were at Stoke Poges, and had started their first round of obstacle golf. With eyes for the most part downcast, and, if ever they lighted on a fellow creature, at once and furtively averted, Bernard hastened across the roof. He was like a man pursued, but pursued by enemies he does not wish to see, lest they should seem more hostile even than he had supposed, and he himself be made to feel guiltier and even more helplessly alone. That horrible Benito Hoover! Yet the man had meant well enough, which only made it in a way much worse. Those who meant well behaved in the same way as those who meant badly. Even Leonard was making him suffer. He remembered those weeks of timid indecision, during which he had looked and longed and despaired of ever having the courage to ask her. Dared he face the risk of being humiliated by a contemptuous refusal? But if she were to say yes, what rapture! Well, now she had said it, and he was still wretched. Wretched that she should have thought it such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have trotted away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Wretched, in a word, because she had behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lock-up and called to a lounging couple of Delta-minus attendants to come and push his machine out onto the roof. The hangars were staffed by a single Bokanovsky group, and the men were twins, identically small, black, and hideous. Bernard gave his orders in the sharp, rather arrogant, and even offensive tone of one who does not feel himself too secure in his superiority. To have dealings with members of the lower castes was always, for Bernard, a most distressing experience. For whatever the cause, and the current gossip about the alcohol in his blood surrogate may very likely, for accidents will happen, have been true, Bernard's physique was hardly better than that of the average gamma. He stood 8 centimetres short of the standard alpha height, and was slender in proportion. Contact with members of the lower castes always reminded him painfully of this physical inadequacy. "I am I, and I wish I wasn't." His self-consciousness was acute and distressing. Each time he found himself looking on the level instead of downward into a Delta's face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with the respect due to his caste? The question haunted him. Not without reason, for gammas, deltas, and epsilons have been to some extent conditioned to associate corporeal mass with social superiority. Indeed, a faint hypnopedic prejudice in favour of size was universal. Hence the laughter of the women to whom he made proposals, the practical joking of his equals among the men. The mockery made him feel an outsider, and, feeling an outsider, he behaved like one, which increased the prejudice against him and intensified the contempt and hostility aroused by his physical defects, which in turn increased his sense of being alien and alone. A chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals, made him stand where his inferiors were concerned, self-consciously on his dignity. How bitterly he envied men like Henry Foster and Benito Hoover, men who never had to shout at an epsilon to get an order obeyed, men who took their position for granted, men who moved through the caste system as a fish through the water, so utterly at home as to be unaware either of themselves or of the beneficent and comfortable element in which they had their being. Slackly, it seemed to him, and with reluctance, the twin attendants wheeled his plane out on the roof. "Hurry up," said Bernard irritably. One of them glanced at him. Was that a kind of bestial derision he detected in those blank grey eyes? "Hurry up!" he shouted more loudly, and there was an ugly rasp in his voice. He climbed into the plane, and a minute later was flying southwards towards the river. The various bureaus of propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-story building in Fleet Street. In the basement and on the lower floors were the presses and offices of the 3 great London newspapers, the Hourly Radio, an uppercast sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and on khaki paper, and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. Then came the bureaus of propaganda by television, by feeling picture, and by synthetic voice and music, respectively, 22 floors of them. Above were the research laboratories, and the padded rooms in which the soundtrack writers and synthetic composers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied by the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus porter, "and tell him that Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting for him on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and hung up the receiver. Then, turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away," he went on in the same official and impersonal tone, and, ignoring her lustrous smile, got up and walked briskly to the door. He was a powerfully built man, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcibly emphatic way, he was handsome and looked, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimetre an alpha plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, Department of Writing, and in the intervals of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the Hourly Radio, composed feely scenarios, and had the happiest knack for slogans and hypnopedic rhymes. "Able," was the verdict of his superiors. Perhaps, and they would shake their heads, would significantly lower their voices, a little too able. Yes, a little too able. They were right. A mental excess had produced in Helmholtz Watson effects very similar to those which, in Bernard Marx, were the result of a physical defect. Too little bone and brawn had isolated Bernard from his fellow men, and the sense of this apartness, being by all the current standards a mental excess, became in its turn a cause of wider separation. That which had made Helmholtz so uncomfortably aware of being himself, and all alone, was too much ability. What the two men shared was the knowledge that they were individuals. But whereas the physically defective Bernard had suffered all his life from the consciousness of being separate, it was only quite recently that, grown aware of his mental excess, Helmholtz Watson had also become aware of his difference from the people who surrounded him. This escalator squash champion, this indefatigable lover, it was said that he had had 640 different girls in under 4 years. This admirable committee man and best mixer had realized quite suddenly that sport, women, communal activities were only, so far as he was concerned, second bests. Really, and at the bottom, he was interested in something else. But in what? In what? That was the problem which Bernard had come to discuss with him, or rather, since it was always Helmholtz who did the talking, to listen to his friend discussing yet once more. 3 charming girls from the Bureau of Propaganda by Synthetic Voice waylaid him as he stepped out of the lift.
"Oh, Helmholtz, darling, do come and have a picnic supper with us on Exmoor."
They clung round him imploringly. He shook his head. He pushed his way through them. "No, no."
"We're not inviting any other man."
But Helmholtz remained unshaken, even by this delightful promise. "No," he repeated, "I'm busy." And he held resolutely on his course. The girls trailed after him. It was not until he had actually climbed into Bernard's plane and slammed the door that they gave up pursuit, not without reproaches. "These women," he said, as the machine rose into the air, "these women!" And he shook his head. He frowned. "Too awful." Bernard hypocritically agreed, wishing, as he spoke the words, that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. He was seized with a sudden, urgent need to boast. "I'm taking Leonard a crown to New Mexico with me," he said in a tone as casual as he could make it. "Are you?" said Helmholtz, with a total absence of interest. Then, after a little pause, "This last week or two," he went on, "I've been cutting all my committees and all my girls. You can't imagine what a hullabaloo they've been making about it at the college. Still, it's been worth it, I think. The effects—" He hesitated. "Well, they're odd. They're very odd." A physical shortcoming could produce a kind of mental excess. The process, it seemed, was reversible. Mental excess could produce, for its own purposes, the voluntary blindness and deafness of deliberate solitude, the artificial impotence of asceticism. The rest of the short flight was accomplished in silence. When they had arrived and were comfortably stretched out on the pneumatic sofas in Bernard's room, Helmholtz began again, speaking very slowly. "Did you ever feel," he asked, "as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out? Some sort of extra power that you aren't using, you know, like all the water that goes down the falls instead of through the turbines?" He looked at Bernard questioningly. "You mean all the emotions one might be feeling if things were different?" Helmholtz shook his head. "Not quite. I'm thinking of a queer feeling I sometimes get, a feeling that I've got something important to say and the power to say it, only I don't know what it is, and I can't make any use of the power. If there was some different way of writing, or else something else to write about—" He was silent. Then, "You see," he went on at last, "I'm pretty good at inventing phrases, you know, the sort of words that suddenly make you jump, almost as though you'd sat on a pin. They seem so new and exciting, even though they're about something hypnopedically obvious. But that doesn't seem enough. It's not enough for the phrases to be good. What you make with them ought to be good, too." "But your things are good, Helmholtz." "Oh, as far as they go." Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. "But they go such a little way. They aren't important enough, somehow. I feel I could do something much more important. Yes, and much more intense, more violent. But what? What is there more important to say? And how can one be violent about the sort of things one's expected to write about? Words can be like X-rays, if you use them properly. They'll go through anything. You read, and you're pierced. That's one of the things I try to teach my students, how to write piercingly. But what on earth's the good of being pierced by an article about a community sing or the latest improvements in scent organs? Besides, can you make words really piercing, you know, like the very hardest X-rays, when you're writing about that sort of thing? Can you say something about nothing? That's what it finally boils down to. I try and I try—" "Hush," said Bernard suddenly, and lifted a warning finger. They listened. "I believe there's somebody at the door," he whispered. Helmholtz got up, tiptoed across the room, and with a sharp, quick movement flung the door wide open. There was, of course, nobody there. "I'm sorry," said Bernard, feeling and looking uncomfortably foolish. "I suppose I've got things on my nerves a bit. When people are suspicious with you, you start being suspicious with them." He passed his hand across his eyes. He sighed. His voice became plaintive. He was justifying himself. "If you knew what I had to put up with recently," he said almost tearfully, and the uprush of his self-pity was like a fountain suddenly released. "If you only knew." Helmholtz Watson listened with a certain sense of discomfort. "Poor little Bernard," he said to himself. But at the same time he felt rather ashamed for his friend. He wished Bernard would show a little more pride. Chapter 5. By 8 o'clock the light was failing. The loudspeakers in the tower of the Stoke Poges clubhouse began, in a more than human tenor, to announce the closing of the courses. Leonard and Henry abandoned their game and walked back towards the club. From the grounds of the Internal and External Secretion Trust came the lowing of those thousands of cattle which provided, with their hormones and their milk, the raw materials for the great factory at Farnham Royal. The incessant buzzing of helicopters filled the twilight. Every 2.5 minutes a bell and the screech of whistles announced the departure of one of the light monorail trains which carried the lower caste golfers back from their separate course to the metropolis. Leonard and Henry climbed into their machine and started off. At 800 feet, Henry slowed down the helicopter screws, and they hung for a minute or two poised above the fading landscape. The forest of Burnham Beeches stretched like a great pool of darkness towards the bright shore of the western sky. Crimson at the horizon, the last of the sunset faded through orange, upwards into yellow, and a pale watery green. Northwards, beyond and above the trees, the internal and external secretions factory glared with a fierce electric brilliance from every window of its 20 stories. Beneath them lay the buildings of the golf club, the huge lower caste barracks, and on the other side of a dividing wall the smaller houses reserved for alpha and beta members. The approaches to the monorail station were black with the ant-like pullulation of lower caste activity. From under the glass vault a lighted train shot out into the open. Following its southeasterly course across the dark plain, their eyes were drawn to the majestic buildings of the Slough Crematorium. For the safety of night-flying planes, its 4 tall chimneys were floodlighted and tipped with crimson danger signals. It was a landmark. "Why do the smokestacks have those things like balconies around them?" inquired Leonard. "Phosphorus recovery," explained Henry telegraphically. "On their way up the chimney, the gases go through 4 separate treatments. P2O5 used to go right out of circulation every time they cremated someone. Now they recover over 98% of it, more than 1.5 kilos per adult corpse, which makes the best part of 400 tons of phosphorus every year from England alone." Henry spoke with a happy pride, rejoicing wholeheartedly in the achievement, as though it had been his own. "Fine to think we can go on being socially useful, even after we're dead, making plants grow." Leonard, meanwhile, had turned her eyes away and was looking perpendicularly downward at the monorail station. "Fine," she agreed, "but queer that alphas and betas won't make any more plants grow than those nasty little gammas and deltas and epsilons down there." "All men are physico-chemically equal," said Henry sententiously. "Besides, even epsilons perform indispensable services." "Even an epsilon." Leonard suddenly remembered an occasion when, as a little girl at school, she had woken up in the middle of the night and become aware for the first time of the whispering that had haunted all her sleeps. She saw again the beam of moonlight, the row of small white beds, heard once more the soft, soft voice that said, "The The words were there, unforgotten, unforgettable after so many night-long repetitions. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Even epsilons are useful. We couldn't do without epsilons. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Leonard remembered her first shock of fear and surprise, her speculations through half a wakeful hour, and then, under the influence of those endless repetitions, the gradual soothing of her mind, the soothing, the smoothing, the stealthy creeping of sleep. "I suppose epsilons don't really mind being epsilons," she said aloud. "Of course they don't. How can they? They don't know what it's like being anything else. We'd mind, of course, but then we've been differently conditioned. Besides, we start with a different heredity." "I'm glad I'm not an epsilon," said Leonard with conviction. "And if you were an epsilon," said Henry, "your conditioning would have made you no less thankful that you weren't a beta or an alpha." He put his forward propeller into gear and headed the machine towards London. Behind them, in the west, the crimson and orange were almost faded. A dark bank of cloud had crept into the zenith. As they flew over the crematorium, the plane shot upwards on the column of hot air rising from the chimneys, only to fall as suddenly when it passed into the descending chill beyond. "What a marvellous switchback!" Leonard laughed delightedly. But Henry's tone was almost for a moment melancholy. "Do you know what that switchback was?" he said. "It was some human being finally and definitely disappearing, going up in a squirt of hot gas. It would be curious to know who it was, a man or a woman, an alpha or an epsilon." He sighed. Then, in a resolutely cheerful voice, "Anyhow," he concluded, "there's one thing we can be certain of. Whoever he may have been, he was happy when he was alive. Everybody's happy now." "Yes, everybody's happy now," echoed Leonard. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every night for 12 years. Landing on the roof of Henry's 40-story apartment house in Westminster, they went straight down to the dining hall. There, in a loud and cheerful company, they ate an excellent meal. Soma was served with the coffee. Leonard took 2 half-gram tablets, and Henry 3. At 9:20 they walked across the street to the newly opened Westminster Abbey Cabaret. It was a night almost without clouds, moonless and starry. But of this on the whole depressing fact, Leonard and Henry were fortunately unaware. The electric sky signs effectively shut off the outer darkness. "Calvin Stopes and his 16 saxophonists." From the facade of the new abbey the giant letters invitingly glared, "London's finest scent and colour organ. All the latest synthetic music." They entered. The air seemed hot and somehow breathless with the scent of ambergris and sandalwood. On the domed ceiling of the hall the colour organ had momentarily painted a tropical sunset. The 16 saxophonists were playing an old favourite. "There ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine." 400 couples were 5-stepping around the polished floor. Leonard and Henry were soon the 401st. The saxophones wailed like melodious cats under the moon, moaned in the alto and tenor registers, as though the little death were upon them. Rich with a wealth of harmonics, their tremulous chorus mounted towards a climax, louder and even louder, until at last, with a wave of his hand, the conductor let loose the final shattering note of ether music, and blew the 16 merely human blowers clean out of existence. Thunder in A-flat major. And then, in all but silence, in all but darkness, there followed a gradual detergescence, a diminuendo sliding gradually through quarter tones down to a faintly whispered dominant chord that lingered on, while the 5/4 rhythm still pulsed below, charging the darkened seconds with an intense expectancy. And at last, expectancy was fulfilled. There was a sudden explosive sunrise, and simultaneously the 16 burst into song. "Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. Bottle of mine, why was I ever decanted? Skies are blue inside of you, the weather's always fine, for there ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine." Five-stepping with the other 400 round and round Westminster Abbey, Leonard and Henry were yet dancing in another world. The warm, richly coloured, the infinitely friendly world of summer holiday. How kind, how good-looking, how delightfully amusing everyone was. "Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted." But Leonard and Henry had what they wanted. They were inside, here and now, safely inside with the fine weather, the perennially blue sky. And when, exhausted, the 16 had laid by their saxophones, and the synthetic music apparatus was producing the very latest in slow Malthusian blues, they might have been twin embryos gently rocking together on the waves of a bottled ocean of blood surrogate. "Good night, dear friends. Good night, dear friends." The loudspeakers veiled their commands in a genial and musical politeness. "Good night, dear friends." Obediently, with all the others, Leonard and Henry left the building. The depressing stars had travelled quite some way across the heavens, but though the separating screen of the sky signs had now to a great extent dissolved, the two young people still retained their happy ignorance of the night. Swallowed half an hour before closing time, that second dose of Soma had raised a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Bottled, they crossed the street. Bottled, they took the lift up to Henry's room on the 28th floor, and yet, bottled as she was, and in spite of that second gram of Soma, Leonard did not forget to take all the contraceptive precautions prescribed by the regulations. Years of intensive hypnopedia, and from 12 to 17 Malthusian drill 3 times a week, had made the taking of these precautions almost as automatic and inevitable as blinking. "Oh, and that reminds me," she said as she came back from the bathroom, "Fanny Crown wants to know where you found that lovely green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt you gave me."
End of Disc 2.